Hello and welcome to Beyond the Bio. This week is a must-listen episode for you if you have any interest in speaking. Specifically, we are looking at speaking on a panel, either as a host or as a panelist. And I have the perfect person to discuss this topic. Oli Barrett is known for knowing people. Described by Wired magazine as the most connected man in Britain, he enjoys connecting people. He hosted the Great British Entrepreneur Awards for 10 years and can be found across any number of events in the UK and beyond, presenting, interviewing and emceeing. Oli's background is entrepreneurial, starting his first business at university, and today he's a shareholder in businesses from a meditation app to theatres and film studios. His passion for encouraging entrepreneurship saw him found the Tenor Scheme, still the UK's largest schools entrepreneurship challenge, and he co-founded Startup Britain, launched with Number 10. I've had the privilege of being on panels hosted by Oli several times now. And the thing that strikes me about the way Oli hosts panels is just how engaging he makes them. He seems to make guests feel very comfortable. He asks great questions and he makes them more entertaining than I think they usually are. So it's a real treat to have Oli Barrett talking all things panels. Let's get stuck in. Welcome, Oli. It's very exciting to have you on the show talking about this topic. Now, I've been on a lot of panels, and if I'm honest, they can often be the boring bit of a conference when there are some great dynamic keynote speakers. The exception to this, and I do tell people this, so I'm not just kissing up to you here, but the exception has been panels that are moderated by you. So what I want to know is, what's the secret to making them so engaging?
That's really kind. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for having me. I think I am so fortunate to get to chair panels, and you're a brilliant panel guest as well, so we should swap tips on this podcast. I find that energy is infectious, and so I only say yes to things in event world that I feel quite excited about in the first place. And I think that enthusiasm cuts through. So for me, it is about energy. It is about a real sense of positivity about the subject. And most importantly, as a chair of a panel, you've got to remember, it's not about you. It's about the guests. So the trick is, how do you get the guests feeling comfortable? How do you get them to communicate their enthusiasm or passion for their subject with each other and with that wider audience? And however much someone might have brought a plan to the table, how do you get that sense of unpredictability that in a way, anything can happen? So the audience start to lean forward instead of leaning back in their chair.
Some really interesting points to pick up on with that. So one thing that I do feel as someone being on a panel that you're hosting is that you know things about me because of the question style that you use. So I'm guessing you must do loads of preparation before the event itself. What's involved in preparing well to be a panel host?
The first thing about preparing to be a panel host is you've got to understand the context. So you've got to understand, what is the point of this event? And that doesn't just mean the subject on the tin. It's, why are people actually here? And so the quicker you can understand that, the better. And you can get that from an event organizer. Why are you actually doing this event? Just so I understand, right? Because then you can get tuned in. Then you understand the context of your panel. So you have to see that wider program. Where do you fit in? What's just happened? What's just about to happen? If it's a 2-day event, what happened yesterday? What's happening tomorrow? Understand where you fit in, because you play a role. And by the way, that doesn't mean a bit like mixing one song into another because they sound very similar. Your job could be to completely change the vibe or the tone or the energy, but just understand where you fit. In terms of preparation, I do a lot of homework. I want to know about the subject. I want to go on YouTube to see what the speakers have said before. If they've been guests on podcasts, I do want to listen to those because there might be hooks that I can pick up on. And by looking at them on YouTube or listening to them on Spotify, I get a sense of what type of person they are. Then I want really fresh insights. So I'll go to whether it's their X account or their LinkedIn. I want to understand what they've been posting recently, not necessarily because I'm going to mention it on stage, but because it helps me when I'm settling them down in the green room and backstage, and it shows that I'm tuned in respectfully to who they are. So yeah, preparation, understand the point of your panel is job number one.
And when you've got a panel of, say, 3 or 4 or whatever it is, do you always meet them before you're actually on stage with them?
I try wherever possible to meet them at least on the day. Let's be honest, going on stage can be a nerve-wracking experience for a lot of people. And I want to reassure them, my personal style is not to ask trick questions. So yes, I'll have supplementary questions because very often the first thing someone says on a panel isn't that good or interesting. Let's be very brutally honest, except with you, Sophie. So I warn them that I will go back for more colour and more detail, but I'm not going to trip them up. So I'm their ally. I'm not Jeremy Paxman. I'm not going to make them look foolish. And I want to settle them into that. Often, I will have had a short call with them, either individually or as a group. But very often for large events, we're not able to do that. But I think it's really important to meet them face-to-face backstage.
I agree. I think that's something that I'm learning in terms of hosting panel events, but also interviewing people. I feel like you just have more of a natural connection and that rapport, and that's really, really important.
Yeah, and I would say to any potential panelist, go and find your chair, go and find your host before. I've had so many events, often big events, where the panelist has been in the venue, they've been having coffee, they've been kind of hiding out in row 6 until just before. And I think that's a missed opportunity to meet a fellow panelist, to meet me as the chair, and just to really get a better sense of chemistry developing.
A couple of things. You mentioned there that you'll have some questions and then someone might give a boring answer. You know, how far do you stick to your script? Do you have all the questions that you think you're going to ask planned out and then just kind of go off-piste a bit depending on where the conversation is?
Yeah, so I will often let the guests into the arc of what I hope we might discuss. In other words, if I want to talk about, let's say, the Olympics was coming up or space travel in the future, where this whole industry is going, then I flag that because then they know, oh, we'll get to that. So then they're not getting stuck into talking about the Olympics in the first section. They know that's part of the plan. So I tend to have a framework, but I'm not afraid to follow my instincts and go a little bit off-piste. That's another great opportunity for any guests to be joining the dots. I've got lots of tips on this, but I think having a sense of where you want to go, and, you know, as a chair, and I'd say this to a guest as well, not every guest needs to answer every question. So having a sense of what some of the themes might be, who you want to go to as your lead on any particular question. So Sophie, to you on that. Some of the questions you might find it, and this can give a good sense of energy, you might find it exciting to throw it up. So who'd like to have a crack at that one? And then really be thinking, again, and this is detail, I know, but about share of voice, which can be hard if you've got some star players. But has everyone had a chance to share, particularly the quieter guests? So really be thinking about that. So auction some of the questions, make some of them much more specific, and then think before the panel, are there particular areas where two of the guests might not see eye to eye? So you're not trying to forge a row on stage, but the ability to spot where two guests might disagree agreeably is gold dust on a panel.
Yeah, I totally agree. Do you think there's an optimum number of guests on a panel?
I don't have a golden number in mind. I tend to feel that less is more. So when panelists drop out, I think, well, actually, a fireside would have been great. The fact that there are just going to be 3 of us is also great. I think it can be so tricky when panels build to, 6 or 7 people. I have tried incredibly hard, sidebar comment, never to host all male panels. I think we have to push harder and harder and harder to make our panels as diverse and representative as possible. And when I say representative, I mean representative of the industries we want to be working in, not always the status quo that we see today. One tip, by the way, and this is for guests and chairs, is when we've got a larger panel and a big subject, I will often, you might have seen me do this, Sophie, start with a question, if we only had 3 minutes, if you only said one thing today about healthy aging, what would it be? And you get a really pithy first answer, because then every guest has spoken and you're only 3 minutes into the panel. Otherwise, guest 4 hasn't even come in and we're 17 minutes in.
That's a really, really good shout. And I think, a couple of points that you made there around that diversity piece. I had a constructive conversation with someone locally who had run a panel event with all white middle-aged blokes. And I said, why have you done this? This is so bad in this day and age. There's just no need for it. And the organizer gave me some rubbish excuse. And I just thought that's not good enough. And actually, you'd have been better off not running that event, because I thought it reflected so badly on them. But yeah, interesting. And then the other thing that you were saying about the size of panels, I was at an event recently that was such a cool event, but they did this panel event and there was like 9 people on the panel, and it was so painful because individually all these people were great and they had such impressive bios, and I wanted to hear from all of them. But they did that thing, I think probably with a fairly inexperienced host, who literally asked them the same question, and you were going down the line and I was just like, oh my God, I'm so bored now, because it's just, there's no mixing it up, there's no conversation, there's no kind of discussion between them. It was really painful.
Yeah, and I think whatever the size of your panel, as a host, you have to show your guests, you have to give them the clues to give those pithier answers. So it might be, and this is tried and tested obviously with politicians, quick fire round. It could be little clues like, let's change gear a bit, and just really, which signals to them. And then you're physically giving them clues that you've got what you need from them. So it could be a thumbs up, it could be a hand up to encourage them to stop speaking at that point. Very often the advice I give guests backstage is, one of the best things you can do for us on stage is to stop speaking, because I will always have more I can come back for. So the pithier, the better.
And I wanted to come on to tips. So tips for hosts and tips for guests. And you've already given us a few golden nuggets within what you've said. But let's think about hosts first off. What top tips would you have for someone hosting a panel for the first time?
For the first time, I think embrace it. Show the audience that you are looking forward to it, and they will lean into that. Realize that you're not there to compete with any of your guests. You're there to help them come across in the best way possible. In theatre, you talk about the fourth wall, which is when the actor talks to the audience or the actress talks to the audience. Encourage your guests to talk to the audience and really put it out there. This is, as I've said before, this is business theatre, really, however serious the subject. We've got to turn the volume up on that. I don't mean literally, but in terms of energy, I think, especially if people have been there for a long time. Actively encourage your guests, and this I talk about as the fifth wall, to talk to each other, to pick up on what the other person said. I want to come back to something Sophie said, either because I want to agree and give another example, or I want to take a slightly different perspective. That is magic on a panel. So encourage those guests not to be afraid to discuss and disagree agreeably with each other. And terribly boring, Sophie, but the golden rule, stick to time. And I mean to the second. And forgive me, I don't do this every single time, but I try my best. Honor the time schedule of the event. And if you've said you'll take questions, cut to questions earlier than you think. It can always be such a shame if you've just got time for one. So cut to questions earlier than you think. Don't be afraid to go out very early in the panel and then come back to the panel discussion. But your job is to keep the energy moving. The golden tip is the number one job of a panel chair is to listen. Listen, 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 because your best moments will come from deep listening to your guests.
Because I think sometimes, particularly when maybe someone's nervous and it is their first time and they've got their clipboard with the questions, they're so determined to get through their questions that they miss that listening piece, because they think, oh, but I've got to get through all these questions. And then someone says something brilliant, and then their next question is completely in a different direction. And as someone watching that, it feels a bit disjointed or a missed opportunity.
Yeah. And that comes back to just being comfortable with the flow, knowing where you're going to get to, and not being afraid to say, thank you, Sophie. We'll come on to that. And then the other technique alongside listening is not to be afraid to go in for clarification, just to say, can you just bring that to life a little bit for us? Can you give us a real example of that? What might that look like in real terms when you're actually running a business? So you might say, Oli, when you're running a business, you've got to be prepared to have difficult conversations. And say, Sophie, let me put you on the spot. Can you think of a type of difficult conversation? And the underlying theme here, Sophie, is I'm always trying to think, what is the man or woman sitting in the 10th row thinking as the panelist answers the question? Are they wondering what the hell that acronym means? Are they asking for more information? Are they thinking that they've gone on for too long and actually we've got enough, thank you, please end the answer. And I try to channel that.
What do you do? And I'm thinking of a specific example that I've seen on a panel you hosted fairly recently, certainly this year. But what do you do when things do kick off a bit and get controversial on a panel? Do you think brilliant and rub your hands and sort of allow it to play out? Or are there any examples where you've had to rein things in a bit because they've got too controversial?
Well, at the risk of sounding mischievous, there probably haven't been enough examples of where it's kicked off. It's so dependent on the scenario. Sometimes the best thing you can do is sit back and watch an interaction play out. And you have to be wondering in your mind, are we witnessing here two respectful grown-ups in business theatre, or will some interventions be needed if something inappropriate is said? If we feel that this is a part of the conversation which we will continue to discuss off stage. If we feel that one of those voices isn't being given a chance to represent themselves, then again, a firmer hand might be needed to say, hang on a moment, John, why don't we hear, etc. So whoever it might be, or hang on a minute, Sue, and just thinking about that. But I think being sensitive to that, and without sounding like some sort of showman, I think understanding what the audience are making of that. And by the way, the job, when I talk about business theatre, the job isn't for it to be positive and jolly and entertaining the whole time. Sometimes those uncomfortable discussions and moments are important. And I think that is the overall point. I think the job of the chair is to hold that space and be trusted and seen to be trustworthy by the audience to keep it together. And it's being able to visibly project that you've got this, you're holding this conversation, you're giving others the space, and you're not afraid to draw lines around it.
Good advice, for sure. Thinking about the tips for guests, any advice you would have for them?
Prepare in advance with a colleague on your own. What do you want to say? And say it as quickly as possible. Don't keep too much in your back pocket. That first answer is so important. We don't need rambling introductions. We don't need gushing thanks to organisers if they've already been said. Be pithy, keep it short, make that first answer really count. Do your homework, especially on your other panellists. It's completely unforgivable not to know exactly who you'll be appearing alongside. And do your research on the chair, partly because it can be very charming and complimentary if you've done your homework. Don't just see them as the person with the clipboard. Understand that they are also there for a reason. Talk to the audience, not just to your chair and to your fellow panelists. Know when to stop talking. And most of all, and this is the flip side of preparation, don't be afraid to amplify what you're hoping to talk about and what you've said and what others said after the event. So few panelists do that. They might say, I was here, here's the selfie, here's the link to the organizer. What they very rarely do is communicate what they feel they were there to try and say, and to shine a spotlight on somebody else to say, I was really struck by my fellow panelist X, who gave me a different way of thinking about Y. That is generous, and that's really powerful, I hope, in business.
I think so. And you've answered my next question, which was going to be, how have you seen people promote their panel experience well? And I think that's a brilliant example, rather than just the standard, hey, I'm here and whatnot. So that's cool. What about when a panelist is very nervous? You must have seen that before. How do you bring them in when they're, have you had people literally shaking on the stage and not being able to get the words out?
Yeah, and backstage at an international event recently, I had an unbelievably nervous, to the point of not really being able to articulate their thoughts backstage, who happened to be an incredibly senior cabinet minister in a very well-known country. It happens to everybody. I think connecting with them personally backstage in a reassuring way, back to the point, I'm not going to trip you up. I'm not going to make you look stupid. I think paying them a sincere, grounded compliment on who they are and what they do, and that is why they should be there, not what am I doing here sort of territory, can be reassuring. Acknowledging on occasion that they are a bit nervous can be fine as well. Giving them a sense of where you will come to them as well. So on this second question about incentives, for example, I'll come to you first on that. And even that, it's a bit like saying, at this moment in the second quarter, I'm going to throw you the ball. Such things wouldn't be predictable, but in panels they are, because you're in charge and you've got that note, and then that can settle them down because they're ready for that.
Good job. Have you got any advice for people wanting to get onto a panel or even to speak at an event?
Well, Sophie, you are the the world expert on this. So for your tips, I recommend all of Sophie's books to you, by the way, and the rest of this podcast. I think it's wide open. I think there are so many opportunities by asking your peers to say, I saw you speaking at that. How was it? Sometimes guests get, and you've seen this and you've been this actually, get rebooked. But actually, often the producers will want to freshen up the casting. So actually saying to a friend, that looked great. Would you recommend it? Would you be prepared to introduce me to the producer, to the organizer? That's a tip. But remain a big fan of long shot emails, actually. So I saw an event which I thought was looking great, Innovation Zero, around climate tech. Threw my hat in the ring, wrote to the organisers saying, this looks fantastic. Please let me know how I can be useful. Next thing I know, I'm chairing at least a couple of panels. And I think the same might be true for guests as well. I think this applies to so many things, Sophie. If you articulate clearly what you want to do and why you want to do it, and then share it with an increasingly wide trusted circle of people, that is an unbeatable way for me. In the next 6 months, I want to start doing more events as a panelist in these sorts of areas. And even if that limits you, it will fire people's mental Rolodex to think of other events as well. So are you absolutely convinced that your trusted supporters know that you want to do it? So that would be another piece of advice.
And I think you've answered my final question, which was around how best to engage with event organisers. So it's being really clear, approaching them and showing, what it is that you're interested in and the value that you can bring to the table.
Yeah, and you can raise your profile within events as well. A friend of mine, Natalie Campbell, used to do it by carrying a yellow notebook, which everyone used to remark upon. But instead of being the person that says, hi, this is my name from this company, and then sort of pitching your company, why don't you say your name and company really quickly and then ask an amazing question? That's far more likely to get you talent spotted by the presenters, by the fellow panelists, by anyone in the room going, they're brilliant. Let's get to know them. And then you go up afterwards and go, thanks so much for taking the question, by the way. And before you know it, you're being booked on to the next one.
Nice. I like it a lot. Oli, it has been awesome speaking to you about this topic because you are the guru of panels, and I genuinely mean that. I think whenever I've been on a panel that you've hosted, I've felt very comfortable and I've felt that you are interested in what everyone has to say and that you bring everyone in really well. I think you've got a huge talent for this, for sure. So
thank you, Sophie. And by the way, I know we're going to wrap up. You've got so into this and you're great at this. What's your top piece of advice for chairs, particularly chairing panels?
Chairs. Well, I've only chaired a few things, and I think the first one that I did was standing in for you for Elite Business,
which you did very well. I watched it on YouTube.
Well, I was quite nervous on that. I wouldn't say it was my finest one, but I'll tell you what I did do after that was I kind of reflected on what I didn't like about that experience, and I really thought it through. And I chaired something recently, maybe a month or so ago, part of my role for SmartWorks, and they'd booked me and they were paying SmartWorks a fee for me to chair this event with 4 women in business, like a women in business event. And I really I thought, what would Oli do? And I did go and do all my research into the 4 guests, and I had some loose questions, and I did exactly what you said before around earmarking certain questions for certain people. And I brought in examples of things I'd read about them to ask them about. And it felt really good. I could feel a massive difference. Like, that was by far the best panel I've ever chaired. And I got loads of really positive feedback afterwards, which I think was deserved because I put a lot of time and effort into prepping for it. And it was good. It was a really good conversation. And actually, I won a piece of business off doing that event because one of the guests really warmed to me and then explored what we did. And
I've seen it so many times, Sophie. I think it's such a good way. Appearing on panels is such a good way, yes, to raise your profile, to hone your knowledge about a particular area, to meet people, and to really get in the practice of clarifying your thinking. So I think I would encourage so many more people to do it because, my goodness, we need a much wider range of voices on these panels. Well, I want to keep comparing notes on this. Thank you for having me, Sophie.
Thank you for being here. If anyone wants to connect with you, is LinkedIn the best place?
For sure, LinkedIn, and all my details are just on Oli Barrett, so OliBarrett.com.
Fab. We'll pop a link to your website and to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes so people can connect with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. If you're serious about growing your profile, take our free profile assessment quiz to see where you're at right now and get hints and tips on how to improve your score. You'll find the link to the quiz in the show notes. If you've enjoyed the episode, it would be mint if you'd subscribe, like, and leave a review. See you next Monday.